We have some time for questions and discussion and comments. Please.
Hi,
introduce yourself, please.
Kevin Alderson. I'm a professor here at the law school. Thank you. You talked about one generation of veterans not abandoning the other, the subsequent generation. I'm wondering what's happening to two categories of other people. One would be the people from other nations in 1990-91, and the second would be what I take to be hundreds of thousands of private contractors in the most current battles.
Good questions.
Thank you. I'll speak just a little bit briefly to what's happening with other countries. We work closely with the British Gulf War veterans for many years, including at one point we had the leader of the British Gulf War Veterans Organization was on the board of when the National Gulf War Resource Center organization was still effective. It unfortunately has fallen into disrepair over the years, but when it was still effective, we had the Brits on the guiding body at that time. We were in communication. There's some language barrier issues as well, but I've been in contact from, since I set up the 91 Outcomes website, I've heard from and I'm now in contact with Canadian Gulf War veteran leaders, Argentinian Gulf War veteran leaders, and we're well aware that the Czechs and other countries have all had, many of them have had similar issues. There was a sense of pride sort of from France for quite some time that the French Gulf War veterans had no health issues, but if you remember back to that map with all the arrows showing where they were, the French were the furthest west, had the least contact with anybody, and were west of the prevailing winds, and they didn't take the PB pills, and they didn't have the same pesticides as us. So put it all together, and it shouldn't be any surprise why their experience is different than the experience of all the rest. And Paul, I'm going to let you talk about contractors. Excuse me.
Let me answer your question about the health impact of deployment to a war zone on contractors. I'll do that with two words: abandonment and Halliburton. They have been abandoned because they really aren't part of the discussion, unfortunately. I think they really should be. The way the military structure changed in 1991 was a far heavier reliance on contractors in the war zone. They're really different kinds. You have the mercenaries who are actually out there defending people, like State Department officials or Reconstruction folks. They're armed to the teeth. They shoot everything in sight. The next and larger group, far larger, is the contractors who are ferrying supplies, flipping burgers, and stuff like that. Support roles that used to be military functions. But because of the heavy reliance on large weapon systems and a huge opposition to the war domestically, and no one enlisting in the military, recruiting is way down, we're relying far more heavily on contractors. They're far more expensive too, I might add. So what's happened is large contractors like Halliburton and some others have essentially abandoned the contractors who work in the war zone. They come back sick with either toxic exposures from the burn pits, from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, or they come back with psychological problems, and they have to fight through the workers' compensation process and unemployment process to try to get help. And I want to let you know, with the folks that I've spoken with on that issue, it has been a train wreck. But we don't have a mission that's part of our 501c3 to take on that group. And I hope somebody does do that. That is a major hole that needs to be filled.
I should add, Paul, when you're talking about contractors, you're talking primarily about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, not the 1991 Gulf.
Yes, correct. Yeah, there weren't very many contractors during the 90-91 war, but just to show you how funny it was, we would be transporting vehicles on the backs of trucks. Imagine a large tractor here, and then the flatbed, and there would be a tank or an armored personnel carrier or Humvees on it. And when it was prayer time, they'd all pull over on the side of the road and create a massive traffic jam. So that's just kind of an indication of you never know what your contractors are going to do in a war zone. Another question.
In the back. Just identify yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Michelle. Paul, can you talk about the role lawyers in the veterans disability process?
Yes. If I was to say one phrase here, veterans need lawyers to navigate through the minefield of the VA disability claim process. And it's sad that it's that bad. However, there is a tremendous amount of hope on the horizon. And this is very good news that we can thank President Obama, VA Secretary Shinseki, and Congress for doing. They have shortened the claim form from 26 pages to 6 pages. I know if a veteran has traumatic brain injury, depression, anxiety, PTSD, or a chronic illness that may affect their ability to focus, filling out a 26-page form is an enormous hoop to jump through and absolutely adversarial on its face. Okay, VCS fought, and now that claim form is 6 pages, and they, in fact, are now even a 2-page claim form for the Easy Express if you just want to increase your rating. Now, here's what's needed. If a service member has a serious condition, like TBI or PTSD, they shouldn't really go through the claim process alone. They should try to find a lawyer to help them out. It shouldn't be that way. Really, the DoD and the VA should be working much better together with records to make sure the system's not so adversarial. But until the adversarial component is removed, until all the paperwork hurdles are removed, and until the records are all straightened out, okay, veterans still need an advocate to help them with their claim. And sometimes the veterans groups that help veterans individually with their claims, they might be good at the local level, but sometimes they're not good in other places. So if you want the gold standard, get a lawyer.
Please.
Paul, you know there's a pro bono consortium in Washington, D.C. for veterans, going
Yes.
back to my generation. Also, lawyers, you don't get paid. It was you would get $10 if you helped a veteran. That's been changed, but you got to know these guys have no money. So if you're going to do this like a personal injury case where you want an expert and review the medical records, and you want to go subscribe to the Army Law Journal, which is about $60 each time you look at it, or the Navy Journal, which I think is $20, it's going to cost you. The Army regs change. What you see on the internet might not be what's actually there. But the big thing, and there's a lot of veteran service groups, there's an excellent organization, like I said, in Washington, is the Pro Bono Consortium that'll train lawyers. But most of it, you're doing pro bono. I mean, every case that I do, and we have some mutual friends to think about, you do for free. So if you think you're going to ask them for a retainer up front, So you should be aware of that, and you should do this. It should be your duty anyway as an attorney. But this isn't a get-rich-quick scheme, and you're not going to be able to do this like Social Security.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. I answered the first half of that question of what really is going on with veterans. For the lawyers, there's different avenues. The first place I would suggest if a veteran needs a lawyer is to go to a website for the National Organization of Veterans Advocates, NOVA. They are the bar for attorneys who represent veterans on a regular basis. And in fact, many of the attorneys who help set up the pro bono consortium are sometimes members of NOVA. These attorneys practice veterans law full-time. They're great people, and they do get paid by VA when they win claims, okay? It's important to know that when veteran is going to hire a lawyer, don't go to one that asks for an upfront fee. That's not going to happen. That's not the right lawyer. The attorney gets paid after the case is done. In some cases, the attorney may not get paid at all. So it's important to know where the claim is in the claim decision process. And I could be here till 5 o'clock in the afternoon explaining that all to you. But just suffice to say, it's important to know where the claim is in the process before you get the attorney. A veteran can only hire an attorney after they have been initially denied their claim, unless, of course, the attorney wants to work for free from the get-go. It's only after that stage that the attorney can get any money. So another organization that you mentioned is the Veterans Pro Bono Consortium. They go around and train veterans around the country to do pro bono assistance. I like the idea. I think it's great. One drawback with that method is that the attorney only may work 1 or 2 claims a year, and they won't become a seasoned practitioner just focused exclusively on VA claims. So although it is very good, and the lawyers doing this are very sharp and very well-meaning, it's going to take a while for their institutional knowledge to get up to speed so they can help veterans on those claims.
Add in just briefly as well, the National Veterans Legal Service Program, NVLSP in Washington, D.C. is, they have a wonderful website, and they also publish the guides on Title 38 for the federal VA and the associated regulations, and their manuals are widely regarded as the gold standard for what claims officers use. The second piece is that veteran service organizations have interests as well, and so the largest veteran service organizations have claims officers, and that's a big part of what they do, and that's a big part of their it's a big part of what they do. And so sometimes we see veteran service organizations, not sometimes, we have seen veteran service organizations fighting legislation that would allow for lawyers in the claims process.
I would add one thing, if I could, just to make a pitch. If there's any of you considering veterans law, take a second or a third look. It is a very rewarding field. To be able to sit down with a veteran whose claim has languished 10 or 20 years, go through the file, find key pieces of evidence, write a brief, submit it to the court, watch that veteran get 20 years of retroactive benefits, which may be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then watch that veteran receive health care, and then watch the veteran be very happy that they finally won their war against VA. The enormous personal satisfaction you'll get when you see some of these cases and help them out. I can't describe it. It's very good.
One more question. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
A practical question. One comment that we hear is that, oh, at least veterans are getting health care in the meantime, and so everything's fine. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what happens to the veterans during these 3, 5, 10, 20 years that they are looking for assistance. What is really their experience?
I'll answer it.
That's a very good question. It's an exceptional question, and that was the point that I have repeatedly tried to make to Congress as well, that when I made the comment of being seen is not the same thing as being treated. So if you're going for PTSD care, I would encourage any veteran that's dealing with PTSD issues to go to the VA or a vet center rather than to a private practitioner. I'm not convinced that there's any place better in the world to go for PTSD care. TBI care, we're finally learning an awful lot after, we're going into our 10th year of war now, 9th or 10th year of war after, with Afghanistan. Iraq has been dragging on now for many years as well, and we're finally getting to the point where we're learning about TBI issues. But for veterans who have issues, many Gulf War veteran symptoms are very similar to multiple sclerosis and issues there. Now there are lots of variations, but people with neurological symptoms, there are also similarities to fibromyalgia, to chronic fatigue syndrome, to irritable bowel syndrome. In fact, those last 3 conditions have actually been service connected by VA for those. But if you can imagine going in with a laundry list of symptoms, and you've got a 15-minute appointment with a doctor who's a resident, or maybe a fellow if you're lucky, almost never an attending physician, and then you get seen again, and you get referred out to some appointments, and they schedule. The VA has because it's a bureaucratic care. You're not going to get the same care that when I pay almost $1,100 a month for my own private health care, which I'm fortunate to be able to buy, and I get my private health care at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. And when I go there and I had lung issues, they simply did a scope and they did a bronchoscopy, and lo and behold, they were able to diagnose I have COPD, and there's no surprise on how or why or where that came from. But the VA has this whole list of first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do that, in just any specialty. And often they're only able to refer you to one specialty or only a couple of specialties at a time. you're getting the picture that not only is it confusing and impossible for the veteran to navigate that system, but by the time they get done, a year or 2 or 3 or 5 has passed, and they're no closer to getting any better with any of that. And again, I'd like to highlight that for Gulf War illness issues, just like with TBI issues and funding, just like with PTSD issues and funding, the problems are in Washington, not with our medical practitioners. The VA has wonderful, committed doctors and nurses and staff, by and large. We hear, of course, like any healthcare system, we hear horror stories, but by and large, we have wonderful staff there, except that the issue with residents, the continuity of care is a serious issue, and then the fact that we don't have doctors that can tell people with Gulf War illness, here's what you should do. In fact, I've already been approached twice in this room today saying, what are you trying new? That's how it goes when we go to see our practitioners, is we tell them what we're trying and what might be working so they can maybe tell their other patients. So that gives you a sense. If you go in now if you go in and you're an amputee, the federal government has dedicated lots and lots of money for amputees. I've heard the difference between leg amputees versus arm amputees, that legs, because they're diabetics, and there are so many more leg amputees than there are arm amputees, that the research was far advanced on leg amputations and leg prostheses than on arms. And that's only finally starting to catch up, because there are only, a much smaller window of, a much smaller pool of folks there. So it all depends, and that comes back to the question again about VA being, you can get wonderful care at a VA hospital, and you can also come out of a VA hospital having had just a conversation and having nothing more than what you went in with, which has been the case in particular for folks like us with chronic multi-symptom illness related to Gulf War illness, or the greatest tragedy of all, I believe, are these Agent Orange veterans and the atomic veterans who are used in atomic test sites and have had no health care. And as a congressional staff member, I had one veteran come in to me who was used in atomic testing and sweeping off debris off of a ship a day after it had been used in an atomic demolition. He had 23 different kinds of cancer at one time. And, there are things worse than dying. And to me, that would be one, is how do you live like that? So that was a much longer answer than I hoped to give. Hopefully I got to what you were asking.
And I'll add to that real quick. I agree with Anthony that the quality of care at VA is improving, but it's the access. 1 in 4 veterans wait 30 days or more to see a VA doctor. VA is starting to improve that, and that's why I mentioned the $35 billion in increased funding at VA. VA's budget has gone from about $90 billion per year to about $125 billion per year, and VA has hired about 30 or 40,000 new staff in the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of them medical professionals with a heavy emphasis in mental health care. So one of our goals at VCS is to cut down the patient wait time so it's 14 days and then 7 days so that veterans can get in to see the doctors faster. And then you touched on something I want to add on. We are fighting to make sure that the training for VA doctors specifically includes a module on what happened to Gulf War veterans, the exposures, what's happening, what does the science show, and what do the veterans need for treatment. And when we get that, then we'll know that VA has had the culture change that we're looking for. We think, and I think this is a fair, and slap me if I'm doing do a denozo on me if I don't get this right, but VA really is experiencing a culture change at the top. We truly believe that. It's one thing to turn the battleship around. Now we've got to get it kicked from 1 knot to 5 knots and up to 30 knots to go full steam to make sure veterans get care and get benefits.
I'm going to just give a very quick example of how things have changed from the 1990s, from right after we came home from the Gulf to now, and that's I served in a lot of places overseas as a special operations troop, and mainly in Africa and the Caribbean. During that time, I had malaria 3 times. And so when I left the military in 1993, in 1994, I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I knew I was having a flare-up of malaria, and I knew what it was because I had it again. And so I went to the VA hospital, and I couldn't get seen because we didn't have this 2 years or 5 years of care. We didn't have any of these presumptives, and so right now, I could have gone, under today's laws, I could have gone and gotten treated for just about anything, but was unable to get treated. And so the only solution that I had, I didn't have any private health care, and I just had assumed naively that the VA would take care of me and people like me. So I just phoned a buddy back at Fort Bragg who's still in the military. He sent me the packet of Mefloquine or Primaquine or whatever it was in the mail, and I took it for, 30 days, and within, a week and a half or 2 weeks or whatever, my symptoms were gone, and I've never had a reoccurrence. But that's an example of how things have changed from then to now, largely through the advocacy work of people like Paul, and a lot of supporting folks. But Paul's largely been our voice as well. And